Martha's hands trembled as she broke the seal on the envelope. The handwriting was looser than Henry's, younger, more hurried, but unmistakably familiar now that she'd seen the birth certificate. She had never heard Eli speak, never seen his face grown, but there was something in the way he formed her name on the envelope. Martha, not Mrs. Lewis, not Mom, just Martha, as if he knew that any other word would be too heavy to bear. The letter was short, not cold but cautious, the kind of words written by someone unsure if they even had the right to speak. If this ever finds you, it means Callie did her job. I don't know what my father told you or didn't. He wasn't a bad man. He just didn't know how to live with regret. Martha paused, her throat tightening. The car was still parked on the roadside, the engine off, the world around her muffled. She looked over at Callie, who stared straight ahead, her ears twitching slightly at the sound of Eli's name. I never blamed him. I just wanted to know who I came from. He visited a few times, told me stories about the house, the garden, your laugh, said you'd never forgive him. I think that hurt him more than anything. Martha closed her eyes. Tears streamed down her face before she could stop them. The ache in her chest was no longer sharp. It was deep, low, old. Regret had its own way of lingering, and now it reached across generations. When Mom passed, he came more often. Sometimes he just sat on the porch with Callie, said he was tired of hiding. But then he got sick too, and before he died, he asked me to find you. I didn't. I waited too long. But Callie, she didn't forget. Martha wiped her face with her sleeve, her eyes blurry, her hands shaking as she folded the letter again. The silence in the car was overwhelming. She had lost Henry. She had lost the chance to know Eli. But this wasn't just loss. It was also a gift, proof that love, even broken, could find its way back. She reached out and gently rested her hand on Callie's head. The dog leaned into the touch, warm and steady. Martha started the engine again, the letter resting on her lap. They weren't finished yet. Someone in Bitter Creek still knew the rest of the story. Bitter Creek was smaller than Martha imagined. Just a scattering of weathered houses, an old gas station with a rusted sign, and a diner with peeling red letters that read Lena's Place home since '72. It didn't look like a town that held secrets. It looked like a place where time got tired and sat down. But Henry had marked this town for a reason, and if there were answers left to find, this was where they lived. Callie perked up as they crossed into town, her ears standing tall, her eyes scanning the streets. Martha noticed. You know this place, she said quietly. The dog didn't react, but she didn't need to. Her body told the story, the calm shift in her breathing, the silent readiness. Martha's heart beat harder. She followed the directions Henry had scribbled beside the map. Hollow Pine Road, last house on the left. The driveway was gravel, uneven and overgrown, lined with wildflowers and wooden posts leaning at odd angles. She parked the car and sat there for a moment, breathing in the mountain air. It was cooler here. Still, she looked at the house. A single-story cabin with blue shutters and a porch swing that creaked gently in the wind. Callie didn't wait. She jumped from the car and walked up the path as if she'd done it every day of her life. Martha followed, her knees stiff, her heart louder with every step. She knocked, once, then again. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door creaked open slowly, and a woman appeared, late 40s, maybe early 50s, with gray streaks in her tied-back hair and eyes that were hauntingly familiar. She froze when she saw the dog. Then her hand flew to her mouth, and her knees buckled just slightly. Callie, she whispered. Her voice cracked, like a door opening after years sealed shut. Martha didn't speak. She couldn't. The woman knelt to the dog, tears falling freely, stroking her fur with both hands, repeating her name like a prayer. Then she looked up, eyes swollen with disbelief, and finally saw Martha. You're Martha, she said, almost afraid to say it aloud. He said you'd come. If I ever saw her again. Martha nodded. No words came, just a deep, quiet understanding that passed between them. This wasn't a confrontation. It was something softer, sadder, a bridge between lives broken too long ago. The woman stood and opened the door wider. "My name's Eliana," she said. And with that, the final chapter of Henry's story was ready to be told. The house smelled of pine wood and old fabric softener. Lived in, but lonely. Martha followed Eliana into the kitchen, where a pot of tea still sat on the stove, half warm. Callie made herself at home immediately, settling on the rug beneath the table like she'd never left. Eliana poured 2 mugs in silence, then sat down across from Martha, hands trembling slightly as she slid one across the table. They didn't speak for a long time. Words seemed too small for the weight between them. Finally, Eliana broke the silence. "He used to talk about you," she said. "Not often, but when he did, it was with a kind of reverence. Like he couldn't believe he'd ever been loved that way." Martha looked down, fingers wrapped tightly around her mug. The ache in her chest had dulled. Not gone, but softened by the presence of someone else carrying the same scar. "He was my father," Eliana continued, voice quiet, "but he never lived like one. He visited, helped Mom with bills, brought books, pictures of the garden. But he kept us a secret, said he'd made choices he couldn't undo, that he loved 2 lives, and one would always suffer." Her eyes met Martha's. "I used to hate you, not because of anything you did, but because you were the name he never stopped whispering." Martha took a long breath. "I didn't know," she said, voice hoarse. "Not really. There were signs. Things he said, things he avoided. But I never pushed. I thought that was love. Letting silence do the work." She glanced at Callie, now sleeping peacefully. "He left me the dog. He left you the truth." Eliana smiled sadly. "And now we share both." They spent the rest of the afternoon going through Henry's journal, the letter from Eli, and the photograph Martha had carried all this way. They spoke about small things, the way Henry cooked eggs, the way he laughed at his own jokes, how he always cried at war movies even when he pretended not to. It wasn't healing, not exactly, but it was something close, like stitching 2 torn pages back together and reading them aloud for the first time. As the sun began to fall behind the mountains, Martha stood to leave. Eliana followed her to the porch. "You don't have to go tonight," she said. "There's space here. Always has been." Martha looked out toward the gravel road, then down at Callie. The dog raised her head and thumped her tail once, as if in quiet agreement. After a pause, Martha nodded. "Maybe I've been gone long enough." The small brass key felt heavier than it should have, not in weight but in meaning. Martha stared at it resting in her palm, afraid of what it might unlock. For years, Henry's old leather journal had sat untouched, kept more out of sentiment than curiosity. He used to scribble in it during quiet afternoons on the porch or after long phone calls with people he never quite explained. "Business stuff," he'd say with a wink, always changing the subject. She had never pressed him. Back then, trust didn't require explanations. She brought the journal to the kitchen, sat down at the table, and placed it beside the folded letter. Callie lay by the door again, watching, always watching. The lock clicked open with surprising ease. The first few pages were just what she expected. Notes about the farm, sketches of garden layouts, to-do lists. But then, a few pages in, the handwriting changed. It became tighter, rushed. And the content, it was something else entirely. "If Martha ever finds this, I've failed." That was the first sentence that stopped her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she read on. "There are things I kept from her, not because I didn't trust her, but because I needed to protect her. And Callie, if she's found you, then my plan worked. It means the truth has a chance to live beyond me." Martha dropped the journal onto the table, breath shaky. Her mouth felt dry. Protect her? From what? And how could a dog be part of a plan? She glanced at Callie, who still didn't move. Her posture was calm, but alert, as if she knew what was written on those pages, and had been waiting years to be seen. She forced herself to keep reading. Henry wrote of a woman named Elise, a name Martha hadn't heard in decades, not since the early years of their marriage, when Henry worked part-time at a shelter just outside town. Elise had been a volunteer there too, young, quiet, kind. She remembered the way Martha used to tease Henry about her, half joking, but he always brushed it off. Now, decades later, her name reappeared in a journal Henry never meant for her to read. Tied to a secret, tied to a dog, and tied to the past in a way that made Martha's skin crawl. She turned to the next page. There was a photo tucked between entries, a black and white snapshot, faded and soft at the edges. Henry, Elise, and in the middle, a little girl holding a puppy. Martha stared at the photo as if it might change if she blinked hard enough. But it didn't. The little girl was no older than 6. Cheeks full, dark curls pulled into a loose ponytail, and a wide, unfiltered smile that lit up her small face. She clutched a wriggling puppy in her arms, the early version of what looked unmistakably like Callie. Henry knelt beside her, hand on her back, his face tilted toward her with a tenderness Martha had never seen captured before. Elise stood on the other side, one hand resting lightly on Henry's shoulder, as if the three of them belonged together. She turned the photo over. There was writing on the back in Henry's handwriting. Callie's first day home, 1987. H. Martha did the math in her head, and her stomach tightened. That was during the year Henry claimed he was traveling for work. The year they had spent mostly apart after that big argument, the one they never really spoke about again. She had assumed he needed space. Now she wondered what else he needed, or found. The pages that followed were raw, scattered. Henry had written as if the guilt poured faster than his pen could move. He never said it plainly, but the truth was there between the lines. Elise had been more than a friend. The girl, unnamed in the journal, was likely his daughter. His daughter, conceived during a time of silence, nurtured in the shadow of another life. Martha's throat tightened. The betrayal cut deep, but it wasn't fury she felt first. It was something far more hollow, grief. Callie let out a quiet sound. Not a whimper, not a bark, just a soft exhale. Martha looked up from the journal and into those deep, waiting eyes. If this dog had been with that child, if she had grown up with her, then that meant Callie had lived another life. A life Martha had never known existed. And somehow, after all this time, she had returned. Not just as a companion, but as a message. As proof. Martha reached for the next page, but it was missing, torn out, carefully. All that remained was a short line scribbled in haste at the bottom of the last entry. If something happens to Elise, find Collowin. Collowin. The name meant nothing to her, not at first, but the way it was underlined twice made her skin prickle. And then it hit her. That wasn't a place. It was a name, and she had seen that name once, a long time ago, on a document Henry made her promise never to open. The attic smelled of dust and time, the kind of quiet that settles over things left untouched for years. Martha hadn't been up there in more than a decade. She climbed the creaking ladder slowly, flashlight in hand, her breath steady but shallow. The name Collowin echoed in her mind like an unanswered question. She didn't know why she remembered it, only that it was tied to something she had once chosen to ignore. There, in the far corner, beneath an old quilt and a stack of Henry's army boxes, was the tin box she had promised never to open. He made her swear. It was a moment she hadn't thought about in years. A warm spring afternoon, the sound of lawn mowers in the distance, and Henry holding the box like it held the weight of the world. If anything ever happens to me, and you need to know, then open it. But not before. At the time, she thought it was something to do with his military past. Now she wasn't so sure. Her hands trembled as she popped the rusty latches. Inside were a few documents wrapped in plastic, a faded Polaroid of a much younger Henry holding a baby, and a sealed envelope with the word Collowin written across it in thick black ink. No last name, no return address, just that single word. She opened the envelope. Inside was a birth certificate. The child's name, Eli Collowin. Mother, Elise Harmon. No father listed, but the date, the location, it all matched what Henry had hidden. She slumped against the wooden beam, her knees too weak to hold her. Eli, a son? Or perhaps a nephew? Her thoughts spun in every direction. Why didn't Henry ever tell her? Why raise another family in silence? then send that family's dog to find her. Unless there was no one left. Unless Callie had come because there was nowhere else to go. Back downstairs, Martha spread the contents of the box on the dining table. Callie sat beside her again, quiet, unmoving. The dog's eyes flicked to the Polaroid, then to the letter, as if she too recognized what lay there or who. Martha's chest tightened as her fingers traced the baby's face in the photo. Then she noticed something else. A folded note tucked behind the certificate. It was dated just 3 years ago. If you're reading this, then Eli is gone, and she's all that's left. There was no signature, just one final line. Tell her what I never could. Martha barely slept. The documents sat on the table like ghosts, each one whispering things she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. But there was no denying it now. Eli Collowin was Henry's child. A child raised in silence. And Callie had been his dog. Perhaps even their dog. The one that grew up alongside Eli, the one that stayed long after Henry passed. And now, with Eli gone too, the only one left to carry what remained of that hidden life. She stood by the window just before dawn, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee she didn't remember making. Outside, the world was quiet, too quiet, like something was holding its breath. And in that stillness, Callie moved to her side. She didn't bark or whine. She just stared out the window too, as if she understood what was about to happen. Maybe she did. There was a folded map tucked into the bottom of the tin box. On it, a route was marked in red pen, leading from their quiet town in Illinois to a remote part of Montana. Next to the town's name, Bitter Creek, Henry had written a single note, "Find Collowin." Whether that meant Eli or someone else, she didn't know. But the message was clear. There was one more truth to uncover. Martha hadn't driven that far in years. She was nearly 74. Her hands ached in the mornings, and her memory wasn't as sharp as it used to be. But there was no hesitation. Some journeys weren't chosen, they were inherited. She packed lightly, the letter, the journal, the birth certificate, and the map. And one framed photo of her and Henry, from back when they still thought they had forever. By the time the sun rose, the car was ready. Callie leapt into the passenger seat without needing to be called. She curled into the seat like she'd done it 100 times. Like this was the way it was always meant to be. Martha looked at her and said softly, "All right, girl. Let's go find what your boy left behind." The first few miles were quiet, filled only with the hum of tires on pavement and the occasional glance between woman and dog. But as they passed the edge of town, Callie lifted her head suddenly, ears alert, eyes focused. She pressed her paw against the glove box. Inside it, Martha found another envelope, sealed, with her name on it, and in handwriting unmistakably, Eli's. The sun was already setting behind the tall trees lining the quiet suburban street, casting a golden, melancholic glow over the pavement. The leaves rustled softly in the warm evening breeze, and the only sound breaking the stillness was the steady rhythm of Martha's worn leather boots. She held a small bouquet of wildflowers in one hand, Tuesday tradition. Every week since Henry passed, she walked the same path to visit his grave. But this time, just as she reached the crossroads where cars rarely passed, something unusual stopped her in her tracks. A German shepherd, sitting motionless, staring straight at her with eyes too knowing to belong to just any dog. Martha didn't recognize the dog. There were a few strays in town, sure, but this one looked different. Clean, calm, and deliberate. The animal wasn't afraid of her. In fact, it seemed to be waiting. Its golden black fur shimmered in the last light of the day, and hanging from its mouth by a worn leather collar was a small black pouch. Martha crouched carefully, unsure of what she was witnessing. And then, in a moment that didn't feel real, the dog took a step closer and gently knelt down in front of her. Her heart skipped. Something about the dog's movement felt intentional, almost human. With surprising tenderness, the dog placed the pouch directly into Martha's hands and then stepped back, watching her in silence. The woman froze, kneeling there on the empty street. Felt like time had stopped. There was a deep sadness in the animal's eyes, a silent grief that somehow mirrored her own. She wasn't sure why, but her throat tightened and her eyes filled with tears. With trembling fingers, Martha opened the zipper on the pouch. Inside was something light, an envelope, old, yellowed by time, and written in familiar, fading handwriting. Her breath caught in her chest. Her name was on it, Martha Lewis, written exactly the way Henry used to write it, with the little curve on the L only he ever made. She looked back up, stunned, but the dog didn't move, simply sat there, still and waiting. The air grew heavier. In her hands, the letter seemed to pulse with something unspoken. Martha's mind raced. How could this be? Who sent this? And why now? She hadn't heard that name in a long time. Not spoken, not written, not since the night everything changed. The walk back home felt longer than usual. The German shepherd followed closely behind Martha, never once brushing against her, but never too far either, like a quiet guardian. Every so often, Martha glanced back, half expecting the dog to vanish like some figment of grief. But she was still there, still watching, still waiting. Clutched tightly in Martha's hand was the letter, sealed but slightly worn, as if it had traveled a long road of its own. She sat down heavily in the wooden rocking chair on her porch, the kind Henry used to oil every spring without fail. The flowers she had picked were forgotten on the table, replaced now by something far heavier. She turned the envelope over slowly, afraid to open it. The handwriting looked exactly like his, that same soft slant, that same loop on the capital L. But Henry had been gone for nearly 8 years, dead and buried beneath that old oak tree in the church cemetery. And yet, here it was, a letter that shouldn't exist. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside, folded with care, was a single page. The words were brief. No date, no greeting, just one sentence. If you're reading this, it means she found you. Martha's heart skipped. She stared at the paper, her mind racing. She? Who was she? Her eyes darted to the dog, now lying quietly at the foot of the porch, head resting on her paws, watching Martha without blinking. A heavy silence settled between them. For the first time in years, Martha felt something stir beneath the weight of her grief. Not fear exactly, but a familiar ache. The kind that came from memories left unresolved. Suddenly, her thoughts were pulled backward, to a time when things had been different. Back before Henry got sick. Back when the two of them lived on a piece of land by the river, raising chickens and drinking coffee on cold mornings with nothing but birdsong in the background. One night, years ago, Henry had come in late, soaked from a sudden storm. He was quiet, nervous even. He never said where he had been, only that he had done something he hoped she'd never need to know about. She had forgotten that moment or buried it, more like. But now it came rushing back. The silence, his eyes, the way he clutched her hand that night. Martha looked down at the letter again, the words now echoing in her chest. If you're reading this, it means she found you. And somehow she knew. This dog wasn't lost. She had been sent. That night, sleep didn't come. Martha sat in her kitchen, the only light coming from the soft glow above the stove. The letter lay unfolded on the table beside her cold tea, as if demanding to be read again, as if there was more to it than that single haunting line. The dog, she had curled up quietly on the rug by the door. She hadn't barked once, hadn't made a sound since arriving. Martha found herself wondering what her name was, if she even had one. And then the answer came to her lips without warning. Callie, she whispered, barely audible. The name felt strange in her mouth, old, but familiar. Henry had once told her, years ago, that if they ever got a dog again, he'd want to name her Callie, after his childhood dog. But they never did. After Henry's diagnosis, everything else, dreams, pets, plans, was put on hold, and then lost. But now, this dog, this moment, it didn't feel like coincidence. Felt like something planned. Callie raised her head slowly when Martha said the name, ears perked, eyes alert. She didn't move, not yet, but her body tensed in recognition. Martha's breath caught. Is that your name, girl? She asked softly, her voice cracking. The dog blinked once. Then, without hesitation, She stood and walked to the table, gently placing her chin on Martha's knee, the weight of her head warm, trusting. Unlocked something in Martha's chest she hadn't realized was still closed. The letter hadn't come alone. This dog, Callie, was part of it. That much was clear now. But why? And how? Henry had never mentioned anything like this. Nothing in their life together hinted at secrets buried so deep they'd surface nearly a decade after his death. Still, Martha remembered that stormy night. The guilt in his eyes. The long pause before he said, "Someday, something might come back. I just hope I'll be gone by then." It had sounded cryptic at the time, but she let it go. Now it haunted her. She stood up suddenly and went to the small cedar chest in the hallway closet. It hadn't been opened in years. Inside were old photographs, keepsakes, and the leather journal Henry used to write in, locked, with the key hidden in the lining of his work jacket. As she pulled it out, her hands shook. Dust rose in the air like ghosts, and there, inside the jacket pocket, was the key, right where he said it would be if she ever needed answers.